Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with emotions, thinking, feeling, and communicating. So your book talks about this idea of the emotional quotient, and the emotional quotient has been compared to the intellectual quotient or the IQ measurement, except that the emotional quotient that a lot of experts are discussing nowadays in modern research or in discussions about competence in organizations or in relationships, this idea of emotional quotient has been defined as the following. Professor Robert Sternberg suggested that emotional quotient is the ability to get along well with other people. Professor Daniel Goleman suggested that emotional quotient deals with managing emotions, knowing how to be sensitive to other people's needs, and learning how to communicate in ways that demonstrate the ability to get along, manage emotions, and be sensitive. So, what does this have to do with interpersonal relationships? Well, as you probably already can tell, emotions have a lot to do with interpersonal effectiveness. Our ability to understand our emotions, our ability to manage our emotions, and to effectively express those emotions in relationships is probably one of the most important aspects of having an effective interpersonal connection with other human beings. So this chapter is going to look into the various aspects of emotions, why they are important in relationships, what are some of the things that we need to be aware of with regards to emotions, and what are some areas that we can think about in terms of potentially improving our own ability to manage emotions if we see that that is something that's necessary. So let's get started. To begin with, let's look at some of the physical manifestations of emotion that we can learn to detect in our own bodies or minds when we experience emotional interactions. So most people, when they are having an emotional experience, whether it's positive or negative, tend to experience increased heart rate. They also tend to potentially have higher blood pressure at that time. We might also encounter the experience of having adrenaline running through our body. You may also experience the tightening of the jaw or the stomach or the muscles, any other aspect of your physical body that demonstrates that there's emotional interactions taking place are something to definitely pay attention to. This is especially the case for those of us that may struggle with understanding what emotions we are experiencing in a given interaction. So some of us are very good at knowing what we feel about a certain issue or what we feel and when we feel it. And others have a little bit more of a difficult time understanding or deciphering what those emotions are. And usually this is because we have been trained by our family systems or by our parents to emphasize emotional experiences or to de-emphasize emotional experiences. So you can think back on your family systems and how your socialization may have influenced the way that you view emotions, the way that you manage emotions, whether you allow yourself to experience emotions and what you do with them. Okay, so there's various physical aspects of emotion. We talked about increased heart rate, blood pressure, adrenaline, the tightening of the jaw. For some people, they may experience feeling that their stomach is upset when they are having an emotional experience. Usually that's negative. For some people, they might notice that if they're feeling upset, their hands start to clench into fists. That would be another cue that there are other types, that there are emotional experiences going on for someone. So I encourage you to think about your own experiences with emotion in terms of yourself and also other people. And perhaps you can identify a couple other areas where emotion manifests in terms of physical manifestation. And the benefit of being able to, like I said a second ago, decipher these cues is that those of us who are not as tuned into our emotions can use the physical cues when we're communicating with other people to better understand ourselves, or in some cases, somebody that you're interacting with may not actually know that they are feeling upset, but if you are good at reading their nonverbal cues, you might be able to tune into something and you can ask questions to help them uncover their feelings so that you can talk about it. In addition to things like physical manifestations of emotion, we can also learn to understand emotions with ourselves and also with other people based on other nonverbal cues. So some of these cues include facial expressions, the posture that people use, different types of gestures that people may use, right? Whether people have other areas of nonverbal cues such as blushing or fidgeting or things like that. Those are also definite nonverbal cues that we can pay attention to. You might also look at hand movement or hand behavior or activity. In the previous slide, I mentioned something about if you see somebody starting to clench their fists, that is definitely something that you want to pay attention to because it's an indicator of what's going on in someone's mind and with their emotions. So hand movement. But sometimes meanings tend to be ambiguous. So for example, you might be sitting in a lecture and you and your colleagues, or maybe you and some other students may, have a few yawns, but the experience of yawning could be because somebody is tired or bored, or perhaps they just need some oxygen, right? These are all reasons why people might yawn. But a person who's up there in the public speaking mode might perceive this to be someone indicating a lack of interest or that they want the presentation to be over, things like that. So it's good to think about the fact that meanings are ambiguous, but I cannot emphasize enough the importance of learning nonverbal cues to the best of our ability in life. The reason for this is that most of the time in communication, there are two aspects of the interaction. There is what's being said verbally, and then there is what's happening non-verbally. And from my own experiences in life, I can share with you that sometimes you get messages non-verbally that do not align with the verbal message, or if somebody's not talking at all, you can learn a lot or figure out a lot by looking at their nonverbal cues, right? So for instance, as a professor, I deal with students a lot. I've had to talk with students sometimes who are in difficult situations because of life, various life issues that they're dealing with while they go to school. And so using the ability to decode facial expressions or how students are feeling is a very important aspect of my job, because sometimes students may not want to come forth by sharing, or disclosing emotions, but if I can read their face expressions, I can tune in and I can talk to them in the right way, or I can, try to be reassuring if I sense and see that they're feeling anxious or stressed, right? So these are very important things to think about, not just in terms of other people, but also in terms of our own capability and our own competence. So one thing to think about is, do the nonverbal messages that we send align effectively with the verbal messages, right? So are we using nonverbal communication in a way that supports the verbal message? Or do we find ourselves in situations where sometimes we say and do different things, okay? So I'll give you an example. There is a lot of research that looks at nonverbal cues, and there's one woman by the name of Janine Driver. She is a PhD in nonverbal communication. She does consulting work for organizations and for the FBI and for police folks and things like that. And what she does is she tries to teach people how to effectively read nonverbal cues, because what she knows as a communication expert, and as I said to you a second ago, a lot of times people will not tell you everything that's going on. And so if you can read the nonverbal cues that people are indicating or demonstrating, you're basically going to be ahead of the game, because you can sense where people are going or what's really going on, even with the absence of verbal confirmation. So one thing that Janine Driver talks about in her communication is looking for verbal and nonverbal consistency. So let's say, for example, that you go on a date with someone, okay, and it's the first date and you feel like the date went really well and you like the person a lot, and at the end of the date, you say something to them like, hey, I had a really good time and it would be really cool to hang out again. What do you think? Would you like that? Or however you would say it, okay? Maybe you wouldn't sound so eager, especially if it's a first date, right? But you could, you could be subtle about it. Well, what are you doing tomorrow or whatever? So if you ask somebody, oh, I had a great time and, would you like to go out again sometime soon? And if the person says to you, oh, yeah, I had a great time too. I'd love to see you again soon. If they say that verbally, but then non-verbally, you see their head shaking in a no direction, okay? So they're saying, oh, yeah, I had a great time. I'd love to see you again. But you see their head shaking in a direction from left to right, going no, right? No, I did not have a good time. Chances are you probably want to believe the nonverbal rather than the verbal because, of course, people have a lot of social etiquette norms that they learn at a very young age. And what this means is that we oftentimes modify our communication so that we are saying and doing things that are socially acceptable rather than things that necessarily are genuine, right? So you can pay attention to nonverbal cues like that. So what is somebody doing nonverbally, and is it congruent with the verbal message? If it is not congruent with the verbal message, then I suggest that you pay attention to that and try to maybe seek further ideas or ask more questions. And another interesting idea that Janine Driver talks about is the touching of the back of the neck. So she talks a lot about, you can actually Google her if you're interested in some of her work. She has a lot of video clips that she'll do for like Good Morning America or things like that. And she'll talk about things like dating, nonverbal dating cues. And this is where I got a lot of this information that I'm sharing with you on this lecture. But another cue that she talks about, which is really interesting, especially with regards to romantic dating and courting practices, is the belly button test. And so basically what research shows, and she talks about this, is that people tend to face their belly button. Okay, so you're standing in a group of people, and let's say there's 4 or 5 people in a circle, and you're facing your belly button towards one of the people in the group, okay? According to nonverbal research, what that shows most of the time is that that is the person that you are most interested in talking to or getting to know or learning more about, or in a potential romantic scenario, that's the person that you're most interested in, okay? So Janine Driver talks about the fact that, if she's in a social group, maybe she's talking with 3 or 4 people, and maybe her face is directed towards one person to the left, okay? So her head is facing the person on her left, and she's talking, to the person on her left with her head facing that direction, but her body is actually oriented towards the person across from her, right? According to the nonverbal research, what that suggests is that she's actually not that interested in talking to the person on her left, but the person she's really interested in getting to know is the person that is in front of her belly button. And so she uses this example to talk about how people, sometimes women especially, will complain about when they go to a bar or a nightclub or, some kind of social event, and they'll say to her things like, oh, Janine, how do I get certain guys to stop bothering me at bars? It's like I'm standing there and the same guy keeps staring at me all night long, and I'm giving him all the cues to tell him I'm not interested, but he just seems to not pick it up. And then she'll say to the person, well, are you facing him with your belly button? And if you're facing him with your belly button, then you probably want to turn the orientation of your body so that that person is not perceiving that you're interested in getting to know them. So there's some very interesting intuitive aspects of nonverbal communication that we can learn to understand a little bit more. Another thing that she talks about in her research, or it was another person who was consulting with the police force and the FBI, who also was a nonverbal expert. But one thing that they teach police officers, for example, is they teach police officers how to read nonverbal cues that people may not even be aware of. So one thing that they teach a police officer, for example, if they pull somebody over for a routine traffic stop, is that if you see somebody's nostrils start to flare, right? So you're looking at their face and you see that their nostrils are starting to get bigger or flare out, what that often means is that you probably want to take a step back or create some space between you and that person, because chances are that person is oxygenating, right? Which often means that they're getting ready to attack, right? So these are various types of nonverbal cues that can in some cases mean the difference between life and death, right? Now, for most of us, reading nonverbal cues is not going to mean the difference between life and death. But if you work in a police job, for example, or in the military, or in other types of positions where you work with the public in potentially dangerous situations, being able to read nonverbal cues really could be something that influences your safety, right? But for most of us in our day-to-day interactions, being able to read nonverbal cues means that we are going to be more competent in terms of decoding people's communication. So what do people actually mean versus what they say? And also we can use nonverbal communication with the way that we communicate so that we are more effective in our relationships and our day-to-day professional communication as well. Verbal expression. Verbal expression of emotions is a very important component of communication and of effectiveness in relationships. For the purpose of this discussion on verbal expression, we want to be able to distinguish the difference between primary and secondary emotions. So, primary emotions are those emotions that tend to develop when we have an experience that is difficult for us, and they tend to be the emotions that are the more vulnerable emotions. So for example, if I'm in a conversation with one of my friends and they say something or do something that's hurtful, my primary emotion in that situation would be feeling hurt. My feelings might be hurt, right? However, a lot of times what people do in response to transgressions, relational transgressions, such as hurtful activities or hurtful behaviors, is they tend to respond with secondary emotions, okay? So the secondary emotion of hurt would be anger. So in some cases, maybe you can even think of a situation where this is applied in your experience. In some situations, it is actually easier for us to be angry at people than to feel hurt because of what somebody did, okay? Now, in terms of the way that we interact with people, there are very clear response implications for whether we focus on the primary or the secondary emotional experience. People who are experts in psychology or people who do marriage counseling or relational counseling or family counseling tend to talk a lot about primary and secondary emotions. The reason that they do this is because they oftentimes do their best to coach people that they might be working with to try to operate or deal with life based on the primary emotion rather than the secondary emotion. Another primary emotion is fear. So somebody might be afraid of something or they might be scared in a certain situation, and rather than being afraid or telling someone that they're afraid, again, they might just get angry because it's a less vulnerable emotion. It makes people look stronger. They're not as weak, right? When we're hurt and we're fearful, we tend to look a lot weaker than we are when we're angry or hostile. So think about your own experiences in life and think about whether you tend to experience the world when people do things that are hurtful. Think about whether you tend to experience that in terms of a primary emotion or a secondary emotion. So the reason that we care about primary and secondary emotions with regards to relationships is because if I am hurt or communicating my hurt to someone, I will talk about things and non-verbally communicate in ways that are different probably than if I'm angry at someone. And what the research shows very clearly is that when people are having conflicts and dealing with conflicts, that human beings respond much more favorably to primary emotion sharing than secondary emotions. So for example, if a friend of mine does something hurtful and I am, feeling some pain about it emotionally, my friend is much more likely to respond with empathy, concern, and care if I can express that hurt through a primary emotion rather than using anger, or hostility or other types of cues like that. So think about that and think about situations where you've had in your life the use of primary and secondary emotions and coping strategies and how effective you think those strategies have been. According to the research on verbal and nonverbal emotional expression, people who are able to effectively express emotions tend to have greater relational success. However, people who are not able to effectively express emotions, or people who tend to express emotions ineffectively, they tend to have more relational dissatisfaction. They also tend to experience more isolation, more anxiety, and they may also be at risk of experiencing or behaving in ways that exhibit what's called misplaced aggression. Misplaced aggression takes place when people are feeling hurt or upset about something in life, and rather than going to the source and talking to the person who has hurt them or upset them, they tend to exhibit aggression on other people or animals or children rather than dealing with the problem that they have with somebody else or an organization or something like that. So for example, a good example of misplaced aggression would be someone who maybe has a bad day at work and they have a boss who is not very kind and unrelenting or something like that. And so it's very difficult for them to deal with their job. And so they might be very frustrated at the end of the workday. And so a person who is frustrated by their job and comes home to their family and then is on a very short fuse for the rest of the evening and always snapping at people and angry at people and yelling at people and things like that, that would be a very good example of misplaced aggression, okay? So basically, misplaced aggression is when you apply aggression to someone when they haven't done anything to deserve it. And it's not that anybody actually deserves aggression. I think I should probably clarify that it doesn't matter what people do in life. It is our responsibility to manage our emotions effectively so that we are not behaving aggressively towards other people, right? However, the idea of misplaced aggression is often something that develops because people are not good at managing emotions or understanding their emotions. And so the idea of misplaced aggression is something that we want to think about. And hopefully we don't do this in our own lives. But if we do see that it happens in our life, we definitely want to work to remediate that and to minimize the use of that coping strategy, because it's very difficult for people to be around individuals who have this tendency, okay? And if you've ever been on the receiving end of someone's negative emotions when you have had nothing to do with that situation, you understand how difficult it is to be on the receiving end of misplaced aggression. So it's always good to think about those situations in life, because I find that it provides us with a lot of ability to empathize with other people, and empathy is one core component of emotional competence. It's probably not surprising to discover that personality can actually influence the ways in which people experience the world. And what the research shows on personality is that it tends to be about 50% genetic or inherited from people that came before us, like your parents or brothers and sisters, things like that, right? Aunties and uncles. And it also tends to be about 50% socialized, which means that our personality develops as a result of the home environment that we're raised in. So personality tends to shape emotions in the following ways. People who are extroverts tend to experience and share more positive emotions than people who are introverts. However, on the other hand, people who experience generalized anxiety tend to have less positive emotions than people that do not. That's probably not too surprising, but it's still worth being aware of nonetheless. So what this points out is that it's always useful to try to work on the perspective that we allow to dominate in our life. So what this talks about in terms of personality or emotional influence is the idea that we can focus on the bright side in life. We can choose to have an attitude of gratitude. We can choose to view the glass as half full versus half empty. And being able to focus on the bright side or the positives in life can shape the day-to-day experiences we have, but they can also shape the way that our personality eventually ends up developing. Now, on the other hand, some people do not look on the bright side of life, and some folks that we know might actually be experiencing a syndrome that has been identified by social science experts called the mean world syndrome. The mean world syndrome is the tendency that humans have sometimes to view the world and experience the world in a negative way because they have negative expectations about what will develop in their lives. Oftentimes, the theory or the idea of mean world syndrome tends to develop or tends to have an impact on people based on the types of media that they consume. So mean world syndrome is a syndrome that tends to be discussed a lot with people who are media scholars or media experts, because what they talk about is the tendency for people who tend to consume a lot of shows, films, different types of public discussions or things like that. Those people that tend to watch a lot of negative content also tend to experience the world in a more negative way. So more specifically, research has shown that people who watch a lot of programming that has a lot of violence in it, so violent TV shows, violent news channels, or channels that show a lot of violent images and things like that, people who tend to consume that type of television a lot or that type of media, they tend to expect that there will be more violence in their day-to-day lives than people who do not consume that type of media. So there is a very real implication here in terms of how we experience the world through emotions based on the kinds of content that we take in. So you can think about this in your own life and where this might apply. So obviously, it's in our best interest to work to cultivate positive expectations whenever possible, right? So for some of us, what this means is that we may want to take a look at the type of media that we're consuming to see if there is a potential for a negative influence on us in terms of the media that we're consuming, right? For others, we may want to take a look at the kinds of relationships that we have. Do we have relationships with people that behave in ways that are emotionally supportive? Are we in friendships with some people who do not behave in ways that are emotionally supportive? How do those relationships affect your emotions and your day-to-day experience of life, right? What are some ways that you yourself could work on improving your emotional experience in life? And what are some ways that you could work on improving your ability to understand your emotions, to manage your emotions effectively, and to express those emotions effectively in relationships? These are all things that are worth considering. I have definitely considered many of these issues in my life. I actually continue to think about these issues on a day-to-day basis in life. And why do I continue to think about them? Well, first of all, because I teach about this topic, so I probably think more about these issues than most people. But because I am in several relationships in my life, right? I have a relationship with my husband or my partner. I have a relationship with my parents. I have relationships with my siblings. I have relationships with friends, right? So because of these relationships, I think about the emotional component in relationships a lot. So I think that this is something that's worth considering for all of us, regardless of what our area of intended career focus is, or regardless of whether we think that we are really good at communicating. There's always room for improvement. Most of you probably are good communicators and you're probably emotionally competent. However, most of us also can probably improve on how we deal with emotions. I certainly have found a lot of areas that I can improve upon in the course of my life. And so I encourage you to be open and honest with yourself about this topic so that you can work to become the most emotionally intelligent person that you can. The research on emotional intelligence, by the way, shows that emotional intelligence is actually a skill that tends to be more important in career advancement and success in jobs than intellectual competence. Okay, so basically, in other words, your ability to behave or play well or play nice with people tends to actually be more important in life than how smart you are in terms of getting ahead. So even just that fact alone, if you're just looking at it from a market perspective and wanting to have gainful employment where you're making the most money that you potentially can in life, right, and you want to get promotions and things like that, if you're only looking at it from a career standpoint, it's still something to take very seriously. Emotional influence based on culture. There are several influences that culture has in terms of how people perceive emotions, how people respond to emotions, how people make sense of situations emotionally. So it's worth thinking about that in terms of our own experiences as well. Now, the first culture that all of us experience in our world is that culture of the family that we grow up in, right? So we all have sort of a national culture that we identify with, and many of us have ethnic or cultural backgrounds that, that we've been taught over the years to preserve, or, various types of maybe, other cultural memberships that we enjoy. So memberships with sports team groups or memberships with certain religious organizations, right? These are all aspects of culture that can shape the way that we view the world. However, the first culture that we all experience is the culture of our family system, right? And so what this means for emotions is that it's worth considering the way that our family systems dealt with emotions. The reason for thinking about this is because when you go and think about your history in your family and you think about the way that emotions were handled in your family system, that will give you a lot of information about potentially how you manage and cope and express emotions in your life, right? So we can think about things like, how were emotions viewed in our families? Did our parents encourage emotional expression, or were we encouraged either implicitly or explicitly, okay? Were we encouraged to not express emotions? Were emotions seen as a sign of humanness, as a sign of showing trust, or were emotions and expressing emotions seen in our family systems as a sign of weakness? How did people manage emotions in our family systems? Did people express emotions calmly in ways that were using primary emotions? Or did people express emotions in ways that were more hostile, where people used secondary emotions like anger? What were the ways in which people talked about emotions or the validity of emotions? Did we give credence or value to the emotional experience in our family system, or were emotions things that we were taught to tuck away and not really experience or talk about? Okay, these are all things worth considering, especially with regards to our own experiences. However, when we look at culture more broadly, we can look at the way in which people experience attitudes or views towards strangers, for instance, and how emotions and culture shape each other. So, for example, in the United States, there tends to be a greater fear of communication with strangers, people that we don't know. On the other hand, in places like Japan, there tends to be a greater fear of more in-depth relational communication. So it's kind of interesting to look at the ways in which culture can shape communication, especially with regards to how emotions are managed. It's also interesting to note the difference between weather or climate and how climate can shape how people express emotions. So for example, research has shown that in geographical locations that are hotter, physically hotter than other locations, there tends to be more emotional expression than in areas or geographical areas where there is more cooler weather, okay? So that's something to think about. You can even think about your own experience this last summer, and maybe you had an experience where it was very, very hot one day, and you couldn't explain why you felt so irritable with the people around you. But maybe it was because it was very, very hot, And what research shows is that when people feel physically hot, they tend to be more irritable and more angry, and they're more likely to be triggered to experience those negative emotions than if the temperature is more moderate, okay? So think about that. Also, what that means as someone who is learning about emotions, or in my case, as someone who teaches about emotions, is that if I know, for example, that the weather is really hot, or maybe my house is hot, I have to be on guard, right? Because if I know that when I'm hot, I tend to get more irritable, then that means I want to be on guard to not be irritable with the people around me just because of the weather, right? Or what the heat level is in the house. Okay, so think about these issues as you go about your communication with people. Now, in terms of location or region, we can think about the fact that in the southern regions of the USA, for example, people are more expressive verbally and non-verbally than they are in the northern regions. That's interesting. But we can also think about terms or phrases that tend to express emotions like love or affection. So one phrase that is always meaningful to people, or usually a meaningful phrase to people, is the phrase, I love you, right? But it's always good to remember that when one person says, I love you, it does not necessarily mean the exact same thing that another person might mean when they say, I love you. So this idea of words meaning the same thing doesn't really hold true. And what we tend to know about communication is that meanings are in people, not in words. So you might hear the phrase, I love you, and in your mind, that might mean a whole host of things, right? Let's say it means devotion, long-term commitment, monogamy, loyalty, trust, having your back, sticking up for you when people, when you have issues in life, being able to count on someone to be there, right? The phrase I love you might mean a lot of things like that. However, another person might just use the phrase I love you because they feel like it's the right thing to say because someone else has said it to them, right? So we need to be conscious of the fact that these kinds of emotional cues and emotional experiences can mean very different things to different people, and also emotional expression and experiences can be different based on culture, based on where we live, based on the level of heat or the environment, the temperature that we're experiencing. So these are all very good things to think about. In terms of emotions, gender also plays a role in terms of how people manage and express emotions. So, for instance, women tend to be more emotionally centered than men. I'm sure that this does not surprise most of you. However, it is good to know what the facts are because it helps us to understand perhaps why people talk about the issues they talk about and why people have the reactions that they have to certain topics of conversation and things like that. However, it's also interesting to discuss the fact that women also tend to express more vulnerable emotions than men, and they also tend to express more positive emotions than men. On the other hand, men tend to express emotions that are more strength-centered. So that means that men tend to be more comfortable usually expressing emotions that exhibit strength. So not being sad, not being afraid, right? Being strong and being someone that people can count on. And of course, what this means for men sometimes is that some men have a difficult time understanding what their emotions are because they have been socialized to not experience emotions and to not express emotions. Now, one thing we know about relationships, especially close interpersonal relationships, is that we need to be able to understand emotions that we have as well as the emotions other people have, and also to be able to manage and express those emotions effectively. So this is worth considering in terms of your own tendencies and the areas of emotional competence that you have and the people that you know. Men also tend to be more activity or action oriented than women. So for example, most people that are women, most women or ladies when they get together are very happy just to sit and have coffee or have lunch and just talk, right? just talk about what's going on in life, talk about their feelings, talk about what's happy or sad in life, and what things we want and all those things. On the other hand, a lot of times when men get together to hang out or to bond, they tend to do things together rather than sit around talking about what's going on in their life or talking about their feelings, right? So men might get together and want to watch a game together, or they may want to go on a hike, or maybe go build something, or any other kind of activity that the men that like to engage in. That is something that's different between men and women in terms of how they experience emotions and how they experience interactions. So it's definitely worth considering these issues. However, we also tend to find from the research that there are interactions between the genders based on what people will talk about with certain genders or sexes. Okay, so men, for example, tend to be more likely to express positive emotions with women than with other men. That's pretty interesting. We can also look at things like relational depth. So generally speaking, when people have more relational depth, or the relationship is a relationship that has been one where people share deep emotions, deeper thoughts, they tend to talk about issues that are close and near and dear to their hearts. Those type of relationships tend to have more disclosure than the relationships where people tend to talk about fairly superficial issues. And another thing that's very interesting about emotion and the ability to decode emotion, and it's not necessarily related only to gender, but it could be, is the idea of power status. And so one thing that the research finds with regards to power status is that in work situations or in certain social situations, people that are in the lower power group tend to be more capable or more competent in terms of nonverbal decoding of the person who's in a higher power position. So for example, if this was playing out in your job, what this would suggest is that if you're in a lower power position, that you would be more competent at decoding your boss's nonverbal cues than your boss would be at decoding your nonverbal cues. When you think about this tendency, there are a whole host of advantages that one might have when they're capable of decoding nonverbal cues, right? And especially if you're in a low power position in an interaction, it is probably worth your while to learn how to decipher or decode nonverbal cues, because you might be able to positively impact the interaction because you're tuning into something that maybe hasn't been verbally expressed, or maybe the person doesn't even know that they're feeling that, but you can sense it. So that allows you to modify your communication based on what you're picking up nonverbally. In addition to culture and gender norms, another thing that influences the expression of emotions are social conventions, or the social behaviors that we feel are most appropriate in a given interaction based on the way that we've been socialized. So for example, emotions that tend to be superficial tend to be more positive, right? So when you're talking, for instance, with coworkers that you don't know very well, or with people that you might see at the grocery store that you just see on a regular basis, but you don't really have a close relationship with them, you're probably more likely to engage in superficial banter, right? So it sounds sort of like this. Hi, how are you? Oh, I'm good. How are you? Oh, I'm great. Doing this, doing that, rocking and rolling, whatever. So in those kinds of social convention interactions, we tend to express fairly superficial emotions. And in fact, if you've ever had one of those interactions on a day when you were not doing very well, somebody probably, would ask you, hi, how are you? And you probably say something like, I'm okay, or I'm good. And maybe on that day, you don't feel like you're okay and you don't feel like you're doing good, but you say it anyway because that's what's expected in that social convention interaction, okay? So it's good to be conscious of that with fairly superficial interactions, we tend to share more positive emotions. And what this means is that they may not always be very genuine. However, when we are dealing with genuine emotions, what we know is that genuine emotions have both the positive and the less positive or negative emotions, okay? So if somebody is willing to disclose negative emotions to you, then rather than viewing it in a negative way, one way to view that is that they trust you enough to actually show that negative emotion or to share that negative emotion or negative experience with you, right? Chances are that we will experience or share about these types of positive and negative emotions in relationships that have greater depth, that we have had for a longer period of time. This makes sense because we have trust that's been established in a relationship and things like that. Now, in terms of the types of emotional expression that tends to predict successful marriages or partnerships, it's very worth considering the fact that in successful marriages or partnerships, people tend to give each other more compliments. So they tend to say things like, I love you, or you're good looking, or you're cute, or you're good at this. In these successful marriages, there also tends to be more face-saving behaviors or face-saving communication. So things like, I'm sorry, okay, or I understand how you could feel that way, things like that. In successful marriages, there tends to be a reduction or a decrease in face threat communication. So face threatening communication deals with any kind of negative communication that basically conveys to someone that they are negative, right? So things like, oh, you disappoint me, or I would have expected more from you, or how could you do that, or, things like that, okay? And of course, happy, successful marriages tend to also exhibit a reduced or lower level of hostility than marriages that are struggling. So hostility being messages of anger, resentment, being mad, things like that. It's definitely worth considering these things, and it's also worth considering the fact that Gottman, who was a relational expert that studied thousands of marriages, was able to predict, based on the relational communication tendencies, which marriages would stay together and which marriages would break up. And his prediction level was very, very high. I think it was in the 90% zone. And what he would do is he would bring people into the lab and he would have them talk about a couple of important issues in the marriage, and based on the types of communication that they would use, he was able to predict whether this couple would stay together or not. And so one of the main things that Gottman suggested based on these thousands of couples that he talked about is that it's important to try to have a communication ratio of positive to negative communication that is from 5 to 1. So a 5 to 1 positive communication to negative communication ratio. Obviously, in day-to-day interactions, this is not always something that's easy to achieve, especially when people are dealing with the stress of life. Maybe you have stress from your job. Maybe you folks are dealing with stress from moving. Maybe there's stress from a new child being added into the family unit. These are all things that tend to stress family systems or partnerships out. However, if you can at least keep that goal in mind in your relationships, and not just marriage relationships, but any kind of friendships or familial relationships as well, if you can keep it as close to a 5 to 1 positive to negative communication ratio, you're probably going to do much better communicating and establishing a positive relational climate than if you are having more negative communication. Social conventions also tend to shape other relationships and how emotion is conveyed or expressed in other relationships, like the parent-child interaction. So there are certain social rules that shape the ways in which parents communicate with their children. So we would expect, for example, that parents would tend to hug and touch and hold hands and care for their children in a much closer way physically when the child is young. And then as a child tends to grow up and gain independence, of course, the child doesn't want to go around holding hands with their parents when the kid is 9 or 10 or even 12. But when you're a young child, that tends to be appropriate, right? So these types of social conventions tend to shape how parents and children communicate. But there might also be other types of social roles that shape what level of expression is considered to be appropriate in more professional environments. So for example, there is an ongoing debate about teachers communicating with students, especially young students, so younger children. And there tends to be an ongoing debate in the educational community about whether, for example, hugging a child in your class is appropriate, even if the child comes up to you to try to hug you. Now, what we know about young children is that they do require a lot of physical nurturing, right? And so if you are an elementary education teacher, for example, and you have children who are coming up and giving you hugs, or they're dealing with, an upsetting situation and you're trying to comfort them, we know that that is something that tends to work with most young children, right? On the other hand, there's also an issue related to boundaries and whether, people should be engaging in touch-related interactions with children that are not their actual children, right? So this is definitely something worth considering and being aware of. But we can also look at different employment, career, or work roles and the types of emotional labor or the emotional obligations that certain types of work positions require. So on page 125 of your textbook in this chapter, your book describes emotional labor as the process of managing and sometimes suppressing emotions based on the requirements of a certain occupational context, okay? So it's very interesting to think about, for example, the fact that if firefighters don't mask their emotions like fear, disgust, or stress, it can actually really impede their ability to help the people whose lives they're trying to save, right? So emotional management of people in firefighting, medical communities, medical care, EMT, the people who drive the ambulances, right? All of these things are very important for folks that work in those types of jobs. However, it's also very interesting to think about the emotional labor that's included in jobs like being a flight attendant, right? Or in customer service positions where you basically have to provide people with a smile and with a positive response in most cases, regardless of what they say to you, right? So think about these types of emotional labor that would be required for the types of jobs that you're considering pursuing. It's always good to think through this because sometimes a job that you're considering or a career that you might be considering pursuing may look really good, but then when you start to look at the subtleties or the nuances of what that actually will require in your day-to-day interactions with people, it might actually be more stress than you're prepared for. Another example that your book provides that's pretty interesting is the fact that money can be a topic that requires a lot of emotional labor for people that work in the finance industry. So for example, your book talks about the fact that financial planners often engage in emotional labor. Researchers have concluded that relationships and communication with clients may indeed be more central to the work of financial planning than portfolio performance reports and changes in estate tax laws and things like that. So for most people, money and the ability to have enough money is a topic that people feel strongly about. So for example, if you are a financial planner and you have clients who are not happy with what you've done in terms of decisions about investments, or perhaps the stock market has gone through some reduction and they've lost some money. These are all types of situations where if you work in finance as a financial advisor, potentially, you might have to deal with managing negative emotions as a result of the job. So it's definitely worth considering these things, whether you're working in, being a flight attendant, whether you're working in sales or customer service. Another area that requires a lot of emotional labor potentially is that of a psychologist or a counselor or even a social worker. These are all types of jobs that require people to deal with a lot of times negative emotions that other people are experiencing and to help people manage those emotions or to figure out solutions to help people be able to experience more positive emotions. However, in the meantime, what that means is that, the people who are treating those individuals have to engage in a lot of emotional labor. So I strongly suggest that you consider this idea as you choose your careers, and hopefully you can work to select a career trajectory that will indeed make you happy and feel satisfied long term. Emotional contagion. It's probably not surprising to most of you to find out that emotions are highly contagious. So what does that mean? Well, basically, what it means is that we catch the emotions that other people have when we hang around people who have certain types of emotions. So why are emotions so contagious? Well, there's a lot of explanations for this. Obviously, we are social creatures as human beings. Obviously, most of us tend to have empathy for the experience that other people are having. In addition, if somebody is around you and they are experiencing a negative emotion, it's very difficult to put up a invisible force field or something to keep yourself insulated against that emotion, right? So, for example, students catch the moods of their professors. Positive, happy professors tend to create students or contribute to having students that are also positive and happy. Wives and husbands catch the moods of each other based on what's going on in day-to-day interactions. So emotion contagion is definitely something worth considering, and you can think about your own experience with this in the family unit. You can think about your experience with this in educational environments, with professors. You can also think about this with other students. Maybe you can think about this in regards to your romantic relationship, right? And so emotional contagion tends to occur fairly quickly. Oftentimes, it tends to happen non-verbally. Okay, people may not even be aware of the fact that they're catching a mood until it's already too late, right? And one thing that is interesting about emotional contagion is that people who tend to be more expressive tend to also be more contagious in terms of spreading their emotions. So those of us, for example, who are extroverts, we like to express our emotions. We like to talk about things in order to make sense of them, right? These types of people tend to be more likely to spread emotions than people who tend to keep their emotions more bottled up, or they don't express them as much. This is not surprising, but it's certainly worth being aware of emotional contagion, because if you find yourself in an interaction with someone, and let's say you walked into a room and you were feeling great, and then you left the room and all of a sudden you feel really depressed or really down on yourself, or maybe, sad or angry, it's possible, it's very possible that you caught the emotion of someone else in the room. So think about that in terms of guarding against negative emotional experiences. Managing difficult emotions. Learning how to manage difficult emotions in terms of our own emotions and also the emotions of other people we may have relationships with is a very important part of effective interpersonal communication. Facilitative emotions are those kinds of emotions that allow us to connect with people. They allow us to have effective communication interactions with people. They allow us to share a sense of ourself with other people so that we can create shared meaning and relational depth and understanding. So, for example, mild irritation in a relationship based on what somebody does can actually contribute positively to the relationship if that irritation is shared in a way that is non-aggressive, that comes from a primary emotion standpoint, and that uses I language rather than defense causing or defense language that would create someone to feel defensive. So for example, if I find that a certain type of behavior makes me feel uncomfortable, or that I don't prefer that behavior, what I can do in order to try to communicate that information in the most positive way would be to be descriptive, right? Describe the actual activity, to talk about the way that it impacts me, and then to make a request for a modification of that behavior. So that might sound like this. I noticed that in this situation, so let's say it has to do with keeping the house clean, okay? This is an issue most of us will deal with at some point if you live with other people. Many people have different expectations about neatness and cleanliness in a house, and so when you share a home with someone, you have to talk about these issues usually, right? So let's use this example. So let's say I say to somebody, my husband, for example, I notice that when you put your dirty laundry on the floor next to your bed instead of in the hamper, that I find myself feeling frustrated and a little bit irritated because I try to keep the house clean, and a clean house makes me feel good and peaceful. Okay? So I would really like to request that you could do your best to put your laundry in the dirty clothes hamper rather than leaving it on the floor next to your bed in the future. Do you think that that's something you could help me with? I would really appreciate it if we could come to some kind of an understanding about how this would work better. Now, in a situation like that, I have described the behavior in a non-hostile way, okay? I have described the impact of that behavior on me, and I've made a request for the behavior to change, okay? So this is one way we can manage difficult emotions in a facilitative way so that we can assist effective communication and obviously effective relationships as well. However, debilitative emotions are also a part of life, and so what we really would like to do in a course like this is to figure out how to take those types of emotions that can become debilitative and to modify them or to sort of package them or manage them in a way where they are facilitative, right? So debilitative emotions hinder effective communication. They break down relational closeness. So for example, when I gave the above example about how people deal with neatness or cleanness, right? If I was to approach that example with a bunch of hostility and anger and labeling and yelling and all of those things, obviously that kind of behavior would not contribute positively to the relationship or to that interaction, and in fact would have a negative impact. So learning how to distinguish the difference between facilitative emotions and debilitative emotions is a very useful skill. And furthermore, learning how to take those emotions we have that can become debilitating and learning how to manage them so that they can be used to facilitate positive interactions is really one main purpose of this course, and especially this topic on managing emotions. So in terms of where these debilitative emotions come from, there are a couple of sources for why we might have debilitative emotional experiences to begin with. And so one of these things deals with genetics. And I talked about this a few slides back, but basically all of us are a combination of both genetics and socialization. And what the research shows is that who we are and the way that we view the world and deal with the world and respond to the world and things like that is 50% genetic, so 50% based on the way that my parents are, right, or how their parents were, but it's also 50% how we are socialized in the family system growing up, usually, okay? So what this means is that sometimes some people might struggle with certain types of emotions because of things like genetic influence. So we see this to be the case for people who are extremely shy, or sometimes they find that their shyness can sometimes even be debilitating, right? We also tend to find this is the case for people who are assertive. So if you are an extrovert and you tend to be very assertive about expressing your ideas, chances are you have a parent who is also very assertive as well, and you probably picked up that genetic tendency from them. However, things like how passive people are, how laid back people are, how verbally aggressive people are, that can also be genetic, right? People might have just an experience of emotions that is stronger than other people based on genetics. And of course, that can be shaped by your family background and by your predispositions, right? So it's good to be aware of the backgrounds that we come from so that we can start to look more scientifically, if you will, at why we are the way that we are and where we get the tendencies to behave in the way that we do. Another type of emotion source that can sometimes cause people to be debilitated is emotional memory. So, for example, sometimes people may have certain events in their lives that are very challenging or traumatic or something like that, and they may not be thinking very much cognitively or remembering the event per se, but there may be times in life where certain other events in the future trigger emotions from past interactions that they've had with other people. Triggers can be things like the way sounds are, or loud sounds, or certain music could even trigger a certain memory. Other triggers might be a smell, or maybe a certain type of relational context, or maybe a relational interaction style, right? So it's worth considering the fact that physiology, sociology, how we're socialized, and also things like emotional memory can shape the way that we experience emotion, and especially more specifically, when we experience emotions that are debilitative, the chances are that there is something going on with regards to physiology or how you're socialized. So if you're socialized in a family system to not express emotions no matter what, then that can actually become quite debilitating, especially if you're trying to have a long-term loving marriage with someone, right? You have to learn how to express emotions, because otherwise you may not be able to talk about things when you need to, or have certain types of connections that you need to have, right? So it's very good to consider these things. Think about how you were socialized. Think about your own experience with emotions that are sometimes debilitating. And this knowledge allows us to modify things whenever possible so we can have more effective relationships. Minimizing debilitative emotions. Now, at some point, most of us will encounter situations where we find the emotional experience to be challenging, okay? Maybe they're not debilitating, but they might bring up fear in us. They might make us feel sort of socially paralyzed, like we don't really know what to do in a certain situation. Maybe we feel like we want to avoid people or situations at all costs, right? But in reality, it's in our best interest to learn how to cope and manage these emotions more effectively so that we can be well-rounded individuals. So there are several things we can do to minimize the effect of debilitative emotions. One of these things is that we can monitor our emotional reactions. So what are the types of situations that tend to trigger an emotional reaction in us or in other people if you're in a relationship? And one way to monitor these things is to keep a journal. You can write things down. What happened? What was the situation? What was the effect on you emotionally? What was the effect on the relationship you have? And what could you do in the future to try to approach that situation in a more positive way? Okay, that would be a great way to work on monitoring emotional reactions. And if you write things down, chances are over time you'll start to see patterns emerging that will tell you a lot about your tendencies or the tendencies of other people. But for the purpose of this course, I encourage you to work on refining and enhancing your own emotional intelligence first, and then if you feel the need, work on other people's emotions and seeing if you can help other people to manage their emotions. What I do not suggest you do, based on the knowledge we've been talking about, is go to your partner and say, well, I learned all this stuff about emotions, and let me tell you what's wrong about how you manage your emotions. Generally speaking, it's really good for us to work on ourselves and manage our own business. And I don't really have much control over the behaviors of other people, but I do have control over my own behaviors, right? Now, I can certainly make decisions that are going to be healthy for me in terms of the types of relationships I have. So if I start to notice, for example, that in one of my friendships that there are certain types of behaviors in that friendship that tends to consistently trigger a negative response in me, then I probably want to share about that with my friend. And then if it's a valuable friendship and the person cares about you, then hopefully that person is going to be receptive. And if they're not receptive, then you want to think about the friendship and whether it's something that you want to continue, right? So minimizing debilitative emotions can happen through monitoring emotional reactions and learning how to modify when necessary to be more effective. You can note the activating event. I did discuss this just a second ago. Talk about what the event was, who was there, what was happening. Are there any types of events in your history that remind you of that event that you're talking about right then? Another thing that's very useful to do is to record your self-talk, or what I call the internal dialogue. So a lot of times in a course like this, or even in many of the courses that we, take in college, there is an emphasis placed on things that are externally observable. So, I can look at the behaviors that people have in relationships. I can look at my own behaviors, right? Those are things that I can describe in a concrete way. However, a lot of time people don't think so much or notice the type of self-talk that they engage in. So what is self-talk? Well, self-talk is basically the internal dialogue that we are engaging in on a day-to-day basis that we do usually silently in our own minds. And the self-talk that we engage in tends to have a very profound impact on the way that we experience the world and perceive other people. So this is one of the reasons why in chapter 3 we talked about the process of self-fulfilling prophecies, right? And how the beliefs that we have about our own competence tend to influence our ability to perform well, and then it's a cycle that tends to recreate and perpetuate. So it's good to become aware of your self-talk and how that might be influencing your experience of the world and, of course, the way you behave. Now, if you start to notice that you have a lot of negative self-talk, then I strongly encourage you to work to modify those messages that you give yourself so that you can learn to try to become your own best friend, right? Another way to think about it would be to think about how you would talk to yourself if you were a young child. I know that sounds a little bit weird and potentially a little bit new agey or therapeutic, but I find that it tends to give people a little more freedom or a little more kindness in terms of how they treat themselves with regards to the various experiences we have in life. So for example, if you went through a very difficult situation with someone and you made some mistakes with regards to how you expressed your emotions, right? There are a couple of choices for how you can engage in self-talk based on that experience. The first choice would be that you could internally, run over in your mind over and over again all the things you did wrong, what that means for you as a person and how you're a bad person because you don't know how to manage your emotions perfectly and all these things. You could really beat yourself up internally, right? Another way to deal with that would be to look at why you responded that way, to look at the history that you have, which would contribute to causing you to respond that way, and then to try to be kind to yourself about the fact that you made a mistake, right? So if you were talking to your child, for example, who was 4 or 5 years old, and they didn't express themselves well emotionally, then you might say to them something like, well, okay, I see that you were upset, and I see that you didn't, I understand that you were frustrated, and, in the future, you probably don't want to hit your classmate, or you probably don't want to yell at your classmate when they do something that's not nice to you. However, I also understand that you felt very hurt, and when people are hurt, they tend to lash out to try to, make themselves feel better, and that you're getting better in terms of working on these issues, and that, you want to improve, which is a huge step in this process. And, so basically what this suggests is that if you imagine yourself as a young child, right? So imagine yourself at 4 or 5 and what you looked like and the things that you cared about and the various issues you struggled with when you were that age, right? Imagine yourself, especially in difficult situations like this, imagine that your adult self is talking to your child self, and talk to your child self in a way where you would want to nurture your own child so that they could improve their communication in the future, right? Most of us would probably want to nurture our kids so that they could work on improving, but also still feel good about themselves as people, right? Most of us would not want to scream and yell and beat our kids up emotionally and tell them how terrible they are. And, most of us wouldn't do that, right? We also wouldn't do that to other people, but we do it to ourselves without even realizing it. So record your self-talk. Start to become more aware of the different internal dialogues that you have about yourself and about the world and what kinds of events tend to bring those out, and work to cultivate a greater sense of compassion and kindness and empathy towards yourself. What you will notice in life, and the research tends to show this as well, is that when you are able to be more kind and loving towards yourself, then you also tend to be more competent at being kind and loving towards other people, especially when they make mistakes. So think about recording your self-talk. Another thing to do is to dispute irrational beliefs. So with regards to the above example I gave with emotional competence and expressing emotions effectively, if you find yourself having a very negative belief about your ability to have relationships, let's say, dispute them. So for example, if you find that you're in a situation where you blew it and you made a mistake with how you expressed your emotions or did not express emotions or whatever, don't latch on to the belief that because of this, that means that I'm never going to be able to have an effective romantic relationship, right? You don't want to hold on to those kinds of beliefs because, as we know from the self-fulfilling prophecy, those types of beliefs can reinforce behavior and can become debilitating. So dispute irrational beliefs whenever possible, which of course becomes easier when you start to record your expressing your emotions. There are several steps that we can all learn to effectively express our emotions. The first of these is obviously learning how to recognize what your feelings are. As I said a few slides ago and throughout this lecture, some of us are not that good at recognizing our feelings because of the way that we were socialized. However, some of us are very good at recognizing our feelings. So, in relationships, what this can mean is sometimes we might need to help other people recognize their feelings, or we might need other people to help us recognize our feelings, right? And if you don't have someone to bounce these emotional experiences off of, you can also work on recognizing your own feelings through journaling, through talking with other people, through considering or contemplation, right? And so another thing that we considered at the beginning is how to recognize your feelings based on physical cues. So for some of us, we don't necessarily feel the emotion, but we can see that our body is starting to react. That's another way that we can learn to recognize our feelings. The second thing we can do to express our emotions is to understand that there is a difference between having a feeling, talking about that feeling, and behaving based on that feeling. So just because I feel that somebody has behaved in a way that's cruel to me or not kind does not mean necessarily that it's in my best interest considering the situation, depending on what the situation is. It may not be in my best interest to share that or to talk about it. And maybe it isn't in my best interest, definitely, to behave in a way that's reciprocal, right? So for example, in a previous slide, we talked about jobs where there's emotional labor. So as a customer sales representative, for example, is someone who deals a lot with other people's emotions, right? So somebody who's in that position will probably deal with negative emotions from customers on a regular basis. But a person in that position really is not supposed to respond with a negative emotion from a customer, regardless of the fact that that customer has expressed a negative emotion, okay? Part of the customer service business is the statement or the assumption, and I know many of you know this because most of us at some point will work in customer service, right? The customer is always right. What does that term mean? Well, that term means that the customer is always right. Their feelings are right, what they want is right, anything we can do to make the situation right is good, okay? So understand the difference between having a feeling, talking about the feeling, and behaving based on the feeling. Just because you feel like you want to do something really negative does not mean that you have to do that, right? And this is where impulse control comes in, and the ability to manage or temper negative emotions comes into play, okay? And this is a skill, by the way, that can be learned. It doesn't necessarily have to be something we learn as young children. We can learn this over the course of our adult lives as well. A third thing you can do is learn to expand your emotional vocabulary. So rather than using words like when somebody asks you, how are you doing, rather than just saying good or okay or so, you can learn to use other ways to express your emotional state of being. So you might learn to think about things that deal with negative emotions without using the word not so good or bad. You might say something like, well, I'm feeling fearful, or I'm feeling anxious, or maybe I'm feeling a little bit frustrated or irritated, or maybe I'm feeling pensive or uncertain, Or maybe I'm feeling, in terms of the more positive emotions, you might be feeling happy or joyful. You might be feeling excited or anticipation for something that's happening that you're looking forward to. You might be feeling comfort or peace, right? These are all positive emotions. And if you're somebody who struggles with your emotional vocabulary, you can just Google on the web. There's this picture that a lot of psychologists or counselors will have in their offices, and it'll say something at the top like, "How are you feeling today?" And I'm sure many of you have already seen this, and I don't mean to take us back to second grade here with our emotional vocabularies, but a lot of us struggle with identifying emotions. So they have these papers, and it's basically like one piece of paper. You can print up the whole thing probably on one sheet, and it will have different emotional experiences that most people experience, and it will have a word for it, right? Plus, it'll also have a facial expression. So it'll say something at the top like, "How are you feeling today?" And then you'll see someone looking really happy, and it'll say joyful, or you'll see someone looking kind of uncertain, and it'll say confused, or you'll see someone looking kind of scared, and it'll say fearful. So I encourage you to look up one of those visual vocabulary sheets if this is an area you struggle with. Also, this is if you have children or are going to have children, this is another great way to teach children how to learn to identify their feelings as well, because one thing that the research shows about children and their ability to be effective socially is that the kids who have parents who are socially competent themselves, so that mom and dad are good at communicating, they know how to manage emotions and express emotions effectively, those types of parents who are able to manage emotions effectively, they engage usually in conversations with their young children about things like emotions, right? And they are able to teach emotional intelligence to their children because they talk about these issues with their kids, okay? So a sheet like that is also very useful if you have children and you want to help to teach them how to experience their emotions and talk about emotions. Another way to express effective emotions, or to effectively express your emotions, is to share multiple feelings. So it's probably pretty rare that in most situations we are experiencing only one emotion or one feeling, right? So let's say you're going to a concert with let's say a music band or a performer that you're really liking right now and that you think is super great. So you're probably not just feeling happy about going, but you're feeling excited about going, and you're feeling gratified about going or grateful about going. Maybe you're feeling a little bit anxious about going because you're wondering, what are my seats going to be like? And am I going to be able to see the performers, right? So learn to share multiple feelings, because what this allows us to do is, again, to discuss these feelings, to understand ourselves and other people more thoroughly. And this allows us to create a better sense of shared meaning and deeper relationships in life. Another thing to manage in terms of expressing emotions effectively is to choose when and where to express our feelings. So one place that we probably do not want to express very deep feelings that are strong, right? So maybe feelings of negativity or rage or anything like that would be in a public place, okay? These types of feelings you probably want to communicate in a more private location so that you folks have privacy to discuss these issues. Also, you want to think about issues related to whether it's appropriate or not to express your emotions. So, for example, in a lot of professional interactions that we might have, it is just simply not appropriate to express how we actually feel in a given situation because of social protocol. So, for example, if you work in a customer service business and you're having a bad day and you're having, let's say, emotional meltdown that day, right? You might be experiencing that emotional meltdown, but it's in your best interest as a professional to learn how to manage that emotional experience, at least while you're at work, so that the people that you have to serve in your job or the people that you're working with do not feel that you are, a basket case, or are not perceiving you to be, having a meltdown or having issues all the time, right? So this is something definitely to consider. Another thing to consider in terms of expressing emotions is that we must always accept responsibility for our feelings, and we must allow other people to have their feelings as well, okay? So what does that mean? Well, that means that I accept responsibility for owning my feelings, and I do not say to people, you made me feel this way, or you made me do this, okay? What I can do is I can say, I notice that when this event happens or when this takes place, I find myself feeling frustrated or fearful or sad, That is a good way to describe feelings in a way where you accept responsibility for feelings and you connect them to events, right? What you do not want to be saying are things like, you make me feel this way, or you make me feel that way, or I can't control my emotions. What you did deserved this response. That's just not appropriate, although many of us maybe have learned that sometimes events in life demand or deserve a certain type of emotional response, right? But in effective relationships and effective communication, what we know is that it's important for people to accept responsibility for their feelings and also for their behaviors, okay? So I might be feeling fearful and I might be going through some anxiety, but does that mean that I have to cut off communication with my husband because I'm anxious about what he might say or do? No. That means that I can accept my feelings, figure out why I'm feeling that way, try to discuss the feelings with him in a way that he's not going to feel attacked or like I'm being confrontational. And if I'm able to approach it that way, then it's more likely that my husband would be able to be supportive in that situation. And if I don't express my feelings that way, then what happens? Well, chances are people start to get defensive. They start to react with more negative affect, and then you have a negative spiral taking place in the relationship. So accept responsibility for feelings in terms of expressing emotions. And finally, when you express your emotions, always consider the communication channel. And a few of you folks have mentioned this in terms of the things you'd like to learn in this class, but it's always good to consider whether our communication is appropriate through the channel that we're using. So for instance, generally speaking, it's probably not the nicest or the kindest to break up with somebody through a text message. I know that some of you may have experienced this on either end, and I'm not judging, and I'm not telling you that you're wrong or someone else was wrong for doing it, because it's my firm belief that all of us are doing the best that we can right now with what we have, right? With the skills we have and the experiences we've had. However, consider the communication channel. If you were on the receiving end of a breakup, would you want someone to break up with you via text message, or would you prefer at least a telephone call, right? On the other hand, if you're dealing with an interaction with someone that you would like to keep a more distant communication interaction with, let's say maybe a colleague at work or something like that, it might be better to communicate issues or areas of potential challenge via in person, right? Or via via email, right? Now, anytime you send an email to someone, you always want to wait a day or two, especially if there's an emotional component to the issue. Wait a day or two before you send the email, because email is impossible to get back. And sometimes if you're feeling heated, you can send an email that is a little bit excessive in terms of the vocabulary you're using, the examples you're using, and things like that. Also, email brings up the issue of emotions and whether we can effectively convey emotions through email, which it tends to be difficult, right? So think about these kinds of things. Think about whether conversations that you're going to have with people are more effectively managed in a face-to-face conversation, or through email, or maybe in person face-to-face, right, versus telephone face-to-face. These are all very good things to consider in terms of expressing emotions. And in this chapter, we've talked a lot about different aspects of emotions, ways that we can manage these emotions, and ways that we can more effectively express these emotions. So thank you for your time. I know this is a little bit of a longer lecture than the last one, but there is a lot of content in this chapter, and I hopefully have conveyed it to you in a way that makes sense to you and in a way where you can see areas for potential improvement. And if you have any questions on this chapter, please feel free to let me know, and I will talk to everyone in the next chapter. Thank you.